me in this weekly or whatever we call it seminar series.
Yes.
My name is Elmond, and I'm an assistant professor of human geography at the University of Alberta. I studied here last year in July, so almost approaching the first anniversary, and I'm quite excited about that. I do work on urban informality and governance, geographies of precarity, particularly in African cities. I work in Harare, I work in Accra, I also do some work in South African cities. But now I'm trying to broaden the empirical scope of my work to even look at cities in the global north, particularly where I live in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Before I came here, I did a postdoc in just and equitable cities at Cornell University. I was there for about 10 months. Soon after I defended my PhD in 2024 in August, I went to Cornell. Then I got this position. But in terms of my education, I did my PhD in geography and environment at the University of Western Ontario. Western Ontario is in Ontario province here in Canada. I finished that in 2024. I studied as a Vanier scholar funded by the government of Canada. I also did my master's at the same university, University of Western Ontario. I finished in 2018. I was an African Leaders of Tomorrow scholar funded by Government of Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and the Muscat Foundation. And for my undergrad, I did at the University of Zimbabwe. I did an undergrad in regional and urban planning, which I finished in 2014, 2010 to 2014. That's a little bit about myself, but I have always have an interest in academia from that very early stage when I was at the university, working with some of my lecturers. Then, when I went to the master's, I didn't do a lot of writing during that time because I had just 1 year to finish the master's degree, and I went to Zimbabwe. Then I came back for the PhD. That's when the real game started. I was fortunate enough because I worked with a really, really good supervisor at Western University who had mentored me throughout those 4 years, and was really good for me because that's when my real academic career really started. Publishing in very good journals and having this ambition as an early career scholar to say this is what I want to do. And it has really worked for me. It has helped me in many different ways, winning awards and also getting funding. Like now I have my own funding as an early career scholar. I'm recruiting graduate students and building my academic career at the University of Alberta. So that's basically about me.
Okay, it's quite an interesting history. So you're at the University of Zimbabwe in which department?
I was in rural and urban planning, but now they have changed everything because of this Education 5.0. They are now talking about architecture and real estate, and then planning is embedded in that. It's very confusing now. But then when we're there, it was really nice. I don't really like the restructuring that they've done because it doesn't add value.
Maybe it does to a certain extent, but it's different from the value that you got.
It does, but in my field, I've kind of felt there's a lot of, you have some programs that were created that kind of duplicates. Sometimes you have an undergraduate program in urbanization, then you have another one in social amenities, and it was like, oh, what is this? So it depends. In some fields, maybe yes, it really helped, but I don't know.
So thank you very much, Doc, for the brief introduction from your side. So to everyone who is joining in, I'm Brunette, and I'm usually the host of the webinars, but sometimes I've got co-hosts. And today we've got Dr. Elmond Bandauko. He's going to be presenting on his very interesting topic, comparing Harare and Edmonton regarding urban marginality. So I'm going to switch off my mic now and my camera, and then we focus on Dr. Elmond's presentation. At the end of his presentation, we're going to open all the mics and give you the chance to ask questions and to discuss. So over to you, Dr. Elmond.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you once again for coming to this talk. I'm an urban geographer, so forgive me. Today I'll be talking urban geography. I know people are coming from different fields, but I'll try my best to be as simple as I can. So the title of my talk today is, Bio-necropolitics and the Governance of Urban Marginality, Harare and Edmonton in a Comparative Perspective. And this is a draft paper that we're working on with my colleague here at the University of Alberta. But the idea emerged from a paper that I published recently in GeoForum where I developed the concept of necrospatial containment, building on the debates around necropolitics and how urban inequalities and urban poverty are managed and governed in different cities. So when you think about everyone live in a city, you might be in Europe, you might be in Africa, you might be in Asia, in Latin America, or in North America. Everyone live in cities. You rely on cities for many different things, transportation, housing, and so forth. But as cities provide opportunities for people who live in them, it's not everyone who enjoys or who benefits from the opportunities that are associated with urban life. So this is what I'm really going to talk about today. So some of the assumptions, when I was still young and thinking about life in other places, I always used to have this assumption that everything is good in the global north or in developed countries. There are no challenges, there are no issues. But when as I started to do and advance in my education and my doing research and also going to other cities, visiting in conferences, then I realized my assumptions were wrong. There are also challenges in cities of the developed countries. Just to start the discussion, when you hear the word marginality, some of you might wonder what exactly does this term mean? What is marginality? So in basic terms, when we talk about marginality or people that are marginalized or that are at the margins of cities, we are basically looking at people who live and work on the margins of cities, people who are excluded, who experience exclusion in terms of, you can see on that image, people enduring housing precarity, overcrowded and poor housing conditions that make them vulnerable to a lot of different things, flooding, outbreak of diseases and so forth. And those people, also excluded from urban employment opportunities. So, and they have limited social and economic mobility. So there are different ways, different forms of poverty and social exclusion that people experience, both in the global south and in the global north. So when we talk about urban marginality, it is mainly a result of structural violence. So when we talk about structural violence, we're looking at the structures, policies that do not create opportunities for people that are racialized, for people that are unhoused, or for people who live in informal settlements, as I will demonstrate later on, even for migrant communities, for people for gender and sexual minorities, even people with disabilities and so forth. So in terms of the context, when I think it's important to understand, I think I've said that urban poverty and inequality these are kind of universal problems. The only difference is how they manifest and the level of support or social protection that people get across the global north and the global south. Once cities are experiencing deepening inequalities and rising poverty, you see that if you go to cities like Los Angeles, New York, you go to cities in Asia, in Latin America, a lot of different problems. In North American cities are grappling with rising homelessness, people experiencing social isolation in a lot of different cities. And in some cities, especially the exclusionary and the financialization of the housing markets. People can't afford rent, and they live in tent. Tent cities have sprouted. There's some in some places where you see, a very extensive, very big tent cities that are, people are living there. And then you can ask yourself, are we actually in the first world? Yes, we are, because there are different, structural or broader structural problems or structural inequalities that result in some of those challenges. The global housing crisis, obviously, the emergence and rapid expansion of slums and informal settlements. 2/3 of the global population lives in informal settlements. What are informal settlements? These are neighborhoods that develop organically without approval of municipalities. They experience multiple infrastructure deprivation. People do not have access to basic water and sanitation. High, vulnerability to climate change, issues around tenure insecurity, and most of them are located in environmentally fragile geographical areas. So these are just, and slums and informal settlements are more pronounced in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. If you go there, you see a lot of, some of these neighborhoods. But also in the global south, you have a lot of homelessness, as I've said, and today I'm focusing on homelessness in Edmonton and informal settlements in Harare, as you shall see. Homelessness, rough sleeping, people sleeping in public spaces, but also even in the emergence and transitional housing facilities. But even in those emergence and transitional housing facilities, there's not decent living. There are not decent living conditions there. There's overcrowding and also experiences and some instances of diseases outbreak because of that overcrowding. But limited studies have explored how biopolitical and necropolitical interventions shape the governance of informal settlements and homelessness. So what I'm trying to do here is that there's a lot of debate in urban studies and urban geography around comparative urbanism. And some people would say, some people have advanced this idea that it is really difficult to compare cities in the global north and the global south. But I think that's kind of a perspective that needs to be challenged. I think it is overlived its relevance, because we see some of these things across borders. So we have to really think about how can we build urban theory in a transnational perspective. So what we have, you see on these two pictures, that gentleman, I think that was a protest, Canada, the land of the homeless. And then you see the other picture of slums and informal settlements on the other side. And homelessness is a big issue because I talked about financialization of housing and the neoliberal restructuring of the welfare state, which pushes people into rough sleeping and into conditions that are not favorable. So my focus for today is just to look at how people who resort to rough sleeping or who don't have access to housing in Edmonton, how does the city authority govern and manage them, and within the context of biopolitics and necropolitical interventions, and how does it compare with what happens in Harare in terms of governance of informality? The two, homelessness and informal settlements, they are all a form of housing informality, but in a different way. It could be housing, homelessness in the context of rough sleeping, like sleeping in public spaces, but it could also be homelessness in the form of encampments, tent encampments, people setting up tents on municipal land, and that is usually considered a violation of municipal bylaws. It's not authorized. So just a quick reflection on the context in terms of the two cities. How do they compare to each other? What are some of the political economy? So it's very important to understand the political economy of any urban environment when you're looking at trying to understand the challenges and opportunities that exist, because the politics of it, the economics of it determine how things unfold. So we all know Harare is a post-colonial city, established by the British South Africa Company in 1890, Fort Salisbury and so forth. And the design and planning and management of Harare in the colonial period was modeled after British town planning. Even the Regional Town and Country Planning Act that we use at the moment, it is modeled against the British Town and Country Planning. It was only revised, I think, in 1996, just cosmetic revisions without reflecting the changes that have happened since independence. So even the municipal bylaws, most of them are colonially oriented. You just have even the framing of it, how they see people, the framing of people that are not in the mainstream economy, and that as a result of informality is really discursive and sometimes stigmatizing. There's state-centric urbanization shaped by economic crisis and political contestation. We all know the politics of Harare, the ruling party versus the opposition. And that has significant implications on urban governance because that, patronage networks, political influence in municipal decision making. But when you look at Edmonton, it's kind of a liberal entrepreneurial urban governance, largely the market forces. But the market forces are not always the best because when you talk about financialization, it's all about leaving everything to the market or the private sector, and it doesn't respond to issues of social housing. In Harare, there's weak urban planning, obviously, often politicized, weak enforcement, the patronage networks, shaping and determining how things happen, how land is accessed and developed. We all know the issues of land barons and so forth. But in the context of Edmonton, there's stronger planning systems, often embedded in the municipal, provincial, and federal governance frameworks. So there's a little bit of effective multi-level governance. But then there's also a difference in terms of fiscal capacity when it comes to resources to intervene within the urban space. Obviously, in Harare has been struggling. It has been facing, a significant infrastructure crisis, as I will demonstrate later on. Even, extending infrastructure in informal settlements is a big problem. Informal settlements have expanded significantly. Now, I think there are, over 100 informal settlements across the city in different sizes. The bigger ones we know, hopefully, Heathcliff Extension and the likes. And some of the informal settlements were actually established by the state after Operation Mrambachina or Operation Restore Order. And then when they were doing Operation Garkai, it was a kind of a humanitarian response to that displacement, as I'll show later on. And how does that tell us about necropolitics as well? But homelessness also in Edmonton is a big issue. We have homelessness, continue to rise. Emergency shelters have also increased, and then but there are also welfare systems to cater for that. But those welfare systems, I'll show, it's not always rosy as people may think. Saying, oh, there's access to welfare. So this idea of the social safety net, that when you are there, the social safety net is there to help you so that you don't fall down. But sometimes the social safety net in Canada and even in other contexts, is also developing holes as the bottlenecks. So why Harare and Edmonton? Quickly, my focus here is I want to provincialize both, this idea of African urban crisis narrative and global north exceptionality. I think when I started, I had an assumption that everything is well in the global north cities, but that's not the case. If you read about urban poverty and inequality in North American cities, you'll be shocked how deep some of these problems are. But also want to expand this concept of necropolitics into urban governance and try to see how we can apply, because a lot of geographers have not really engaged with necropolitics in terms of understanding how cities are run and the implications for different social groups. But I also want to destabilize these simplistic moral geographies, some of the assumptions that African cities are violent and unequal, and then Canadian cities are humane and progressive. I will demonstrate that some of these assumptions are not correct. If you have never been to a Canadian city, maybe you don't even if you've been there, you have never witnessed some of these things. You can see on those pictures. Those are people, especially this picture on the bottom right. You see, these are people that are living in Canada, in Edmonton, and it might be worse even, especially in bigger cities like Vancouver or Toronto, where the housing cost is extremely high. So like I said, this idea emerged out of the paper that I published recently in GeoForum, where I developed the concept of necrospatial containment and slow violence. So necrospatial containment, the way I conceptualized it is a mode of governance where informal settlements are kind of dumped and confined in places of perpetual precarity we feel like the government withdraws from intervening in there. So that kind of violent state inaction is what I describe as necrospatial containment. And I conceptualized it using 4 pillars: infrastructure as a deathscape, where people respond through high-risk alternatives like getting water from polluted sources. Then the other dimension is the perpetual threat of erasure around the tenure insecurity and the displacement and the uncertainty that is associated with not have tenure security. And then the other one is geographies of spatial constriction. Spatial constriction, which has to do with being in a place that doesn't offer opportunities for social economic mobility. You are free to move in and out of the settlement, but in terms of your life chances, you are so much restricted. And then the other one, in terms of the theory, the theoretical framing for this comparative paper between Harare and Edmonton, I've talked about biopolitics and necropolitics. So some scholars have said that biopolitics and necropolitics can operate simultaneously within the same urban space. So that's why the title is bio, then in bracket necropolitics. So biopolitics, which was a concept developed by Foucault, which is a mode of power and governance that seeks to manage and optimize life processes through regulation, surveillance, and control. So, and the primary focus of biopolitics is to improve the living conditions of populations. Like when governments and cities do slum upgrading, that's a biopolitical intervention, because you want to improve tenure security. You also want to improve access to services and infrastructure. You also want to make sure that people have good quality housing. But even within those biopolitical interventions, there are also people that are always left behind because of the different power dynamics. So and when you look at biopolitics and necropolitics, some scholars have said necropolitics, this is actually a governance model that has to do with creating what are called death wells. Like you are confining people in conditions that can actually result in them experiencing death, or premature death, or incremental death, or over a long period of time. And this was necropolitics. I think some of you who are in social sciences, Mpembe, who has developed this idea. And this necropolitics, it has now been applied in many different fields to understand even how migrants are treated in refugee, how migrants and refugees are treated in refugee camps. But now urban geographers are also beginning to adopt this concept of necropolitics, just to understand the governance of people and places that are not on the margins of our cities. So it's about how urban precarity is enacted on structurally vulnerable groups by authorities of power, either through enforcement or wishful, lack of interventions. So the state inaction within informal spaces can actually be a form of necropolitics, because it can lead to a lot of different negative implications. So biopolitics and necropolitics often operate simultaneously. We're talking about protection of lives. Then necropolitics is about letting some people die while others live. So this is, the conceptual framework that I developed in the paper that where this comparative study is coming from. So I've talked about the 4 pillars of necrospatial containment and how it all relates to what I'm going to talk about today. So just to talk about the key themes in terms of how necropolitics and biopolitical interventions operate and their implications in Harare and Edmonton. So the first theme that we've developed is what we call governing through spatial castrality. So when we talk about spatial castrality, we are not talking about prisons in their we're not just talking about incarceration in its literal sense, But we are mainly concerned about, the understanding the logics and the logistics of the punitive state, punishing people by putting them in places where their rights and freedom are violated. So when you look, that is an emergency shelter in Edmonton, emergency and transitional housing. So this is about intentional confinement of populations whose visibility and mobility in public spaces is considered to be a nuisance or pathological, right? You don't want to see them there because one, what will be the image of the city? What will outsiders say about the city's image in terms of that? And even when you look at in the context of informal settlements, their location, most of them are located in the peripherals of the city, where you don't have to, to visualize and see. So if you are a visitor, you drive through, when you get to, Robert Mugabe International Airport, you drive through into the CBD, you don't see any of that informal settlements, those informal settlements, because they're kind of hidden in private somewhere else. And if you remember, I think in the 1990s, when I think Queen Elizabeth came to Harare, I think during a meeting, and every informal settlements that were close to the airport or in the in the zones of visibility were actually demolished because they didn't want people to see. So informal settlements in Harare, my study has demonstrated that there are always feelings of entrapment and chronic waiting. Even if people have positive feelings about where they live, at least they have a place to stay. But that feeling of entrapment and chronic waiting is always common because they'll tell you, since we stayed here for over 20 years, we have not seen any significant improvement in terms of living conditions. But, and this is also a result of the violent colonial political economy. So I've talked about, when you look at the colonial logics of governance during that time, and what has happened in the post-independent Zimbabwe, nothing has really changed. So there's specialization of containment and punishment because the framing of informal settlements of people who live there, these are, kind of outcasts. These are places that are not desirable. They violate planning regulations and they just invade public land. And homelessness in Edmonton, the experience is that of enclosed warehousing, zones of exception, where you just, making people live there because that's where they, you're trying to intervene, but your intervention doesn't really provide people with opportunities to progress. So it is related to this idea of of geography of spatial constriction. You are caged under condition of bare life. Stigmatization is very common of informal settlements. But even in Edmonton is the common thing. There's stigmatized urban districts because most of these spaces are concentrated in downtown places. So emergence shelters and transitional housing, concentrated and long, have been, within that. And there, in terms of access to opportunities and social services, usually there's very limited access there because there's separation from employment, family, and community networks, and that becomes really a problem if someone has got underlying conditions. They are unhoused, but they also have underlying conditions, but they are also further away from social community networks. So if you look at that quotation in blue, it was, some of the interviews that I've done with people living in informal settlements. And one participant was really very clear about their life, the feeling of entrapment that I talked about, like living in a very small box where there's very little room for maneuver. So if you think about it and think about the idea of a prison in a literal sense, right? And how I think there's a lot of pictures that are always published about the conditions of prisons in our country. And although I called it open incarceration because of some of the challenges that happen there, feeling trapped, no possibility of escape or improvement for the rest, sometimes for the rest of your life. You only rest, you die, you go and get buried in Mbudzi, that very close to where Hopley is. So this is the reality in informal settlements. And another participant, interesting, I still see this place as a holding camp. Remember, a settlement like Hopley was established in 2005 as a holding camp, temporary holding camp, to accommodate the victims of Operation Restore Order. But it has since expanded into a permanent informal settlements, but without adequate infrastructure and services. The way the government treats us is inhuman, as if we are merely being kept here rather than being recognized as citizens with rights and dignity. So if you talk to people in Hopley, they will tell you that there's a common phrase. They always talk about we are treated as non-citizens, non-residents of Harare. But they are geographically located in Harare. So that tells you a lot about how public institutions see some of these spaces. But there's the second theme that I want to highlight is across Edmonton, between Edmonton and Harare, is what we call palliative governance and the necropolitics of care. So when we talk about palliative governance, and the necropolitics of care, what we are saying here, I think Shona Mnochis, forgive me, I was speaking in Shona a little bit. There's a phrase, kuruma uchifuridzira, which means if you think about what happened during Operation Murambachina, right? And then the government implemented Operation Garkai after Operation Murambachina. So in other words, humanitarian response to urban displacement, and then you create settlements like Hopley, Stone Ridge, and so forth. But then you provide minimum support. There's limited infrastructure investment. Over time, they continue to deteriorate. They continue to endure that deprivation. So it's kind of a state-sponsored necropolitics. That's what I call it. So if you look at this quotation, it's very interesting. So you are exercising compassionate and care in relation to a suffering subject. A subject the state is neither willing to let die nor willing or able to fully care for. So this is palliative governance. It's like you're taking pain is just to relieve the pain, but it doesn't actually cure the underlying condition that we have. So these are some of the contradictions when it comes to intervening, where biopolitics and necropolitics operate simultaneously. So even within the context of emergency shelters, you may think emergency shelters are a humanitarian response. You don't want people to sleep or to engage in rough sleeping. You take them into emergency shelters and transitional housing. But then you are also punishing them through control and surveillance. There's very strict surveillance in those spaces. Sometimes I think there are some rules that you can't have visitors. There's control in terms of the time you can get in and out of that. It means your freedom of movement is violated. And what we're saying in this paper is that sometimes people who go to emergency shelters, they are said they might have mental conditions and so forth. There's nothing wrong in kind of instituting a behavioral reform. We are not dismissing that, but I think the way or the logics through which these things are done is problematic. And then the other third thing we also proved from these two cases, which is kind of common and interesting, is the necropolitics of erasure and dispossession. Remember, I talked about tenure insecurity. That is very common in informal settlements. And this is the main ground of evictions, because the land doesn't belong to you, you don't have papers and so forth. Or even in places like Hopley, although their existence is dependent on political expedience. So if you don't support the ruling party, you may be evicted and your house may be demolished tomorrow. And in Hopley, at Cliff Extension, and a lot of different informal settlements, there's this chronic trauma that is associated with the history of repeated evictions. Some of the participants I've engaged with, they've been evicted or displaced more than 6 times. So can you imagine, even if you know that you are sleeping but that chronic trauma is kind of embedded in your everyday life. What I call the condition of affectability. It keeps hanging on your head, and you're thinking that, oh, and that kind of uncertainty is really very, very serious. And in Edmonton is the kind of the same thing, because people who build encampments on public land or municipal land, because it's considered violation of municipal bylaws, sometimes there's very aggressive dismantling of these encampments. So if you look at some of the statistics of the figures there, look at the numbers, right? You may think, oh, that's 2,100. It's not a small number for a city like Edmonton. And that tells you the problem to do with homelessness. And you have 2003, look at that, over 2,000 throughout those years. It's a number. It's really big, and it shows you how people are struggling, even in the cities that are so-called developed. Look at that, like 49 homeless encampments dismantled in Edmonton since the lawsuit was scrapped. So the violent dismantling of informal settlements is kind of common, the displacement and dispossession, and the logics and the rationalization is kind of similar, because pathological practices, pathological spaces, and vulnerable people that should not be seen in public space. So let me go then to talk about some of the key issues that I want to highlight in as far as these experiences are concerned. One of the common thing between Harare and Edmonton is the colonial logics of dispossession and marginalization. When we think about dispossession and marginalization in the context of Harare, I think I've talked about the colonial and the post-colonial continuities in terms of governance. Repressive governance continues to happen even today. So the independence you have is just it's just the name. It is independence for some people, but not for you. So you're always living in very uncertain circumstances, because you may think I can be displaced every day. But the other thing is even in Edmonton and in most Canadian cities, this settler colonial planning, it's a very common thing. So if you look at Edmonton, of all the people that are unhoused, 56% of them are Indigenous. And that tells you a lot about the history of Canada and Indigenous dispossession and so forth. And that's why there's a lot of talk and practices and interventions to think about how do we heal the past and reconcile. Neoliberal urban governance, especially in Edmonton, housing affordability crisis, has triggered people into homelessness. Neoliberal restructuring of the welfare state, because there's limited investment into emergency shelters and transitional housing, and how do you make them better? But we see both, across both cities, we see this criminalization of poverty and marginality. Being poor and being, at the margins of cities is actually criminalized. And we have to think about that if we're thinking about building inclusive cities that work for everyone. But we cannot progress if we still have these repressive interventions, the way we treat people. So one of the things that happens in most Canadian cities is this. So when we look at emergency shelters and transitional housing, you are just, doing the bare minimum to keep people or to keep the unhoused alive, and you minimizing any disruption that may cause, but still maintaining the status quo. In other words, you are not addressing the structural constraints that lead to homelessness in the first place. So what you're just doing is to make sure that you create conditions of survivability and maintaining the status quo. So, and the same logic applies to Harare. Informal settlements are applied, created or emerge just to warehouse unwanted populations, especially those that are created by the state. Then they are left to suffer under conditions of chronic vulnerability, chronic waiting for the state that may not show up. Just to end, So what I'm saying is that the key message here is informal settlements and emergency shelters are, we can see them as necrospatial, necrospatial spaces where, there is socially sanctioned dehumanization sustained by a mode of open governance in which the state may decide not to intervene or violently intervene through demolitions and displacements. So the inaction of the state is a mode of governance in its own, because it then creates conditions that, trap people in precarity for many years without, prospects of social and economic mobility. So the makeshift structures, improvised pit latrines that people use in places like Hopley, the plastic shakes, the homelessness tents, they become necrospatial artifacts that create conditions of slow death, exposing residents to diseases and bodily risks. So, and across both cities, we see the normalization of a life-threatening living conditions. And the excuse that you get usually from politicians is that we don't have money to invest in informal settlements or to extend infrastructure in those spaces. But well, is it, it starts with the perspective or the mentality or how they see these spaces. So that those discourses, those narratives, it becomes institutionalized, and then they inform practice in terms of what happens. So that brings me to the end of my talk today. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Elmond. It was quite enlightening. I mean, I wasn't expecting this, actually. I was expecting, something in geography, but I'd like to admit it's a little bit emotional, actually. Your talk is very informative and very emotional. I stay in Harare, and when I say I stay in Harare, I don't stay in Harare. I'm part of the people whom you just mentioned. I stay in the margins of Harare, right? And it's true, we always have this expectation, like, well, are we registering our houses with the council now? Or they come, the councils want to register, or during elections, they come with an office, everyone needs to register, you get your papers, and it never happens. So now people are just forming committees and building their own houses and their places, and trying to drill boreholes, getting electricity, getting ZESA. But like you said, they're just maintaining the status quo. Like they won't give us these facilities because they want to keep us there, right? And to maintain their hold. So to everyone, I think your mics have been unmuted now. So if you're interested in asking a question to Elmond to start the discussion, which will be co-chaired by Dr. Tatenda, may you please raise your hand, and then you'll choose you according to the number of raising your hand. So over to you, Dr. Tatenda, if you've got any questions for Elmond before you go to the floor.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Burnett, for facilitating this wonderful talk. And Doc Elmond, I've known you for a few years now, and I've been following your trajectory, and it's really nice to see where you are and how far you've come. I'm assuming you did public policy in your master's, or I'm...
No, I did master of public admin, but I was focusing on local government and urban policy.
So yeah, that's, I think I remember that connection as well in your work, and it's nice to see how you are still in the same path, looking at urban issues. It's an interesting part of geography because it's also there's some parts of, I guess, in the policy arena. I think that's why maybe Burnett was saying, I was expecting, when I hear geography, I'm expect to hear about the weather and climate change and etc. And people kind of assume that, but there's this component of urban planning that we rarely hear about, but it's very important. Thank you for this. I remember being in Vancouver in 2018 and being surprised at seeing the rate of homelessness. And I like how you have you've done a juxtaposition with the case of Harare. However, I started thinking about what causes homelessness, at least in the case of Vancouver, I started digging into why do they have this issue, and it turns out it's more related to drug abuse, right? There's usually more on an individual level than it is at the state level, whereas the state, yes, fails people who have these health problems of drug addiction. They may not know how to help them, but it seems as if I'm to think from a very, I'll say I'm not an expert in the field, but from my own observation, I would say, oh, this is an individual problem as far as how you got there versus people in the case of Harare who are displaced from their homes and end up in a precarious situation as far as housing is concerned. I wouldn't see where maybe Canada as a state would inflict homelessness on its people based on displacement. I would assume that they would probably have a more humane way of dealing with something like that, where maybe there's a fundamental problem with the structures where the people live, and then they'll find housing for people to go because I think it will have implications at the even as far as voting is concerned. I would like you to comment on that.
Very good reflections. Thank you so much for mentioning it. Because when I started, I want to spend a lot of time, talking about the drivers of homelessness. And when I remember when I was teaching my students in cities and urbanism, we were talking about Canada's affordability crisis, housing affordability crisis. So the drivers are at two levels. I like you have kept at it nicely. They are individual drivers of homelessness, or social, drivers, which can have to do with family breakups and so forth. But the structural drivers themselves are very important. While there's one thing that I want to mention, Canada, for instance, has the least proportion of social housing among OECD countries. I think it's at 4% against an average of 8% in the OECD. If you compare what happens in Finland and other OECD countries, Canada is very backward in terms of providing for social housing. So everything is left to the market. So if everything is then left to the market, and then people's wages are not increasing, like in those cities you mentioned, Vancouver, very expensive. And it's common for people not to afford rent. And you talk about, there's something you mentioned about dealing with these things in a humane way. And the reason why they have these emergence and transitional housing systems is part of their social protection system. But it still has loopholes in terms of what I've shared. Like if someone cannot afford rent, maybe their money is not enough. Obviously, you can't live for free. The landlord has some places the landlord can instigate and drive or start the eviction process, and that's why you may see some people going on the street because maybe they've lost their job and whatever the social support they're getting from the state is not enough for them to survive. So it's a very complex scenario. But I like what you've said that here they may do it in a humane and compassionate way, but that humane and compassionate way, what I call palliative governance, might not even be. When you go to the emergency shelters, it's very sad what happens there, and because most of these emergency shelters are run by civil society organizations, but with support from the provincial government and so forth. So yeah, it's a combination of factors, but the structural drivers of homelessness are also very important. Like what does your housing policy say? How much do you invest in social housing, for instance? But you are right to point out that the way we see evictions and displacement in our context is very aggressive. But we see that here as well, as I've shared there, in what happens with the homeless encampments, the tents, and the way the police deal with those people. It's kind of similar because sometimes it's very violent. People die, but not in big numbers, but some people may die during that process. And there's something that I also didn't mention in terms of the precarity and vulnerability. What also then amplifies the suffering in this context is the extreme weather, especially during the winter. For the homeless people, that becomes really another aggravating factor in terms of suffering and vulnerability and so forth. So this is what I would say, but I really like your reflections in terms of, how can we, look at these different dynamics in a kind of different way. I agree. Back home, sometimes the way we treat people is really aggressive and inhumane. You can think of Operation Murabachina and how it was implemented. That's a classic example of that.
Thank you. Do you see any hands? I don't see any hands yet, Brunette.
Yes, I don't see any hands, but I think people are interested. So now we've got hands. Yes, I was trying to activate the cameras and the mic. So now I think it's working. So the first question that we have is from JM. So may you please unmute your mic and ask. JM?
Am I on?
Yes, you're on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bandauko, for an insightful talk. So my check is on the occurrence of informality between Harare and Edmonton. I forgot the spelling. Then there is what we call the informality is different in terms of the peripheralization of this informality. In Harare, it's more of crawling. The informality is in the outskirts of the city. Whereas in Ontario, they offer the shelters, the tents within the city, in the downtown of the town, where they can control the people. While in Harare, they put them in the outskirts. For example, what you have mentioned before on the Operation Murabachina, they move out the people from the Suru farm and the Pota farm to Hope. So they manage the people in terms of re-urbanizing, to take control of the urban population, because the ruling party has lost control within the city. So they want to take people from the city, the inner city, to the outskirts of the city, so that they can incorporate them, so that they can protect their votes in the city. Then there's also an issue of this geographical marginality, in which these people who are suffering precarity within the city, sometimes they are not that docile. They can do what you can call, they can practice what you call auto construction, which they use makeshift materials to construct their house, so that they can support themselves while there's the absence of the government support. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, should I respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think here there's something that JM mentioned, very interesting, which I didn't show in my presentation, but it's there in the paper that I published, in terms of how these people negotiate necropolitics. And he mentioned something about auto construction and the way they rely on their community-based resources and innovations to challenge some of the exclusion in the absence of the state. But one point that I then make in the paper in Geoforum is that, in as much as these people engage in auto construction and community-based responses to infrastructure challenges, there is also dynamics around reproducing the same conditions that perpetuate precarity. Because one, if you look at people building in pit latrines and the way they develop the infrastructure, it may not be sustainable, or it may further expose them to health risks. And in another paper, we develop a concept of supported self-provisioning, where we argue that the state and other non-state actors should come in and then work together with communities to develop resilient infrastructure and services. I think he mentioned something important around the peripheralization of informality and pushing people on the outskirts. This is what I've said, that they're usually located in the periphery. So when they go on the periphery, sometimes they're disengaged from what happens in the city. There's poor connectivity in terms of transportation. But in the context of here in Edmonton, most of them are in the downtown areas, even within the core of the city, you see encampments there and so forth. But even within those spaces, obviously they struggle because they're in places where there are no services or social networks on whatever they need. So thank you, JM, for those reflections. I think they're important.
Okay, thank you. So next we've got a question from Siposisiwe Ncube. You can go ahead, Siposisiwe, and unmute your mic. If anyone else has got a question, please raise your hand and we'll come to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Bandauko, for the presentation. Just want to say it's such a pleasure to be a part of this. I've cited you extensively. When I was doing my master's, I learned about the rights to the city from some of your work. And I just wanted to ask, would neoliberalism be a form of necropolitics in itself?
Very good question. Very good question.
But you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think she mentioned something which is very important, and we are engaging with that. I didn't show it here. We're engaging with that in the paper. There's what is called necroeconomics. Necroeconomics, I think it's
please, before you start answering the question, I think the question is what needs to be explained first so that we know what you're answering.
Oh, thank you so much. Let me explain the question. The question is simply saying, is neoliberalism a form of necropolitics in itself? So when we say neoliberalism, let me explain it in very simple terms. It is an kind of an economic management system where there's very limited state intervention in certain stresses. Like in the context of housing, we can say everything has to be determined by the market, and then the state doesn't really intervene. It leaves everything to the market forces, demand and supply, and everything there limited. That is what I can basically in simpler terms.
Yes. So I just want to say it's ISAP in Zimbabwe in the early 90s. Economic Structural Adjustment Program. I can just add.
Yes, that's kind of a neoliberal economic restructuring. So what she's asking is it a form of necropolitics in itself? Remember, I said necropolitics is a mode of governing in which you let other people die or live, depending on who they are. So in the paper, there is what we call necroeconomics, right? Necroeconomics is, we are saying the market forces determine what happens in terms of access to housing. So if everything is left to the market, this is where we have problems now, right? We don't have social housing. We don't have adequate social housing for people that are vulnerable or for people that don't have enough money or income to at least get a mortgage or even to rent. So what then happens is it pushes people to engage to resort to homelessness and rough sleeping. And some of these things we're talking about. So directly or indirectly, it becomes an amplifying factor when it comes to necropolitics. But in a structural way, but it is, everything is connected here. So I wouldn't say it's a form of necropolitics, but I would say it's actually an amplifier of necropolitics or a major driver of necropolitics because of the different implications it has on access to services or access to things like housing.
Okay, Elmond, while we're still on that question, can we have Prof. Edmond trying to add more to that question and maybe you can answer it in a whole context? Yes, Edmond.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Prof, for the excellent presentation. I'll make my question short. So adding to what Sibusiso mentioned, right? We know like we have California, which is highly neoliberal. But in that same space, it is one state with maybe the most significant or most obvious structural violence when it comes to housing inequality. So can you add on that, on why is it when the politics speaks right, it doesn't translate to actual equality when it comes to housing? Thank you.
Yeah, your question, Prof, is a bit tough, but I like how you framed it. And the way you framed it takes me back to some of the things that I've said. A very rich state like California, but when you go there, there's a lot of inequality. And people may think that, oh, because California is very rich, so then it translates to everything. And that is the problem to do even with the financialization of housing, or the problem to do with capitalism. There's a lot of work of people that have criticized capitalism as in, how capitalism creates all these problems. So I would think that, in that context, when everything is left to the market, it's all about profit. But then the social good in itself is not prioritized. So whether you provide social housing or people that need the housing the most, it doesn't become a priority for the state of California or even the government itself. So the fact that you have the US, as a very rich economy, but then a lot of inequalities, not just in California, but in many different states, it's very common. Capitalism and neoliberalism, everything is left to the market. And then you don't really see a lot of priority when it comes to social housing or providing social goods, at least for people that are on the bottom ladder of the social strata.
Okay, thank you, Elmond. Tatenda, you have a question. After Tatenda, I'm going to ask a question from the chat from Roderick. So Tatenda, can go ahead.
Okay, you've opened a can of worms. As far as the discussion is concerned, I was trying to not, bring the economics element to this, but these are all tied together because you're touching on the political economies side of things.
Yeah, the economics is not on me. I'm not an economist, so forgive me if I interpreted it wrongly.
No, we are just going to talk, from an economic standpoint. I agree with your sentiments. I agree with, I think, the philosophy that comes with the talk. However, I also grapple with something internally where I understand economics from a academic standpoint. Do I like what happens as far as what capitalism does? No. But from, I guess, if you want to take it back to human evolution, the survival of the fittest theory that some people have, I then don't know to what extent should we say this is just life, in terms of some people make it and some people don't. And how should the state position itself philosophically? Because sometimes if we're looking at the health side of things, you know that the NHS has a different philosophy, right? Compared to, let's say, the German healthcare system, compared to Obamacare. And that has a lot to do with state philosophy, where do you think that such things are a human right? Does your voting base or your voting, how do I say it? The political philosophy in the country, does it adhere to these principles? If you mess with the NHS in the UK, even if you are a capitalist, you know you're done as a politician. That's the philosophy. If you're in the US, however, for example, you want to have such a socialistic view to healthcare, you might also end up losing your political career as a politician. That's a philosophy within the country where it's fine that some people are homeless because they ended up here and da-da-da-da-da, right? It's some life choices you made and you end up where you are. We are in this position where I think and I believe, especially in the case of Zimbabwe, we have taken capitalism to a degree that it has negative implications to this point, right? I do remember a speech by the president who was saying, quoting an author who wrote this book that says, "Shut up and make money. Stop complaining about what these issues that are happening and go and make money." That's a very capitalist and one of the extreme versions of capitalism, right? So if this is the state's positioning and this is the state's philosophy, we now see it being translated. You're complaining about the University of Zimbabwe and Education 5.0, where the professors are being told to go look for money. The state doesn't need to fund you when it comes to XYZ. This is the survival of the fittest philosophy again coming in its way. And survival of the fittest may not necessarily mean you're the smartest person in the group. You are the most biggest contributor to society as far as humanitarian efforts are concerned. We're looking at who knows how to get what they want in life, and those are the people who make it. Now we're at this position where we're not talking about state philosophy. I don't know to what extent you comment on this, but these are things that come in my head as I grapple between what does it mean to be human, but how has life been since our evolution as humans, as far as people who survive and people who make it are the ones who are like this? And to what extent do we say the state should intervene?
Yeah, those are very tough questions and I think very important to look at when we're looking at the role of the state and the philosophy of the state. It's something that I think it could be. I actually see a potential paper for me there, and then we're linking it up with what happens in cities.
I was just thinking that. I was like, we need a book, because this really is a very interesting interdisciplinary way of looking at things, because we have people who may look at it from an environmental justice perspective, where people who can look at it from the urban geography perspective, and we're a large network, right? So we have people who can even look at it from the education standpoint, like what I've just mentioned, that what does it mean when you say that go look for your own funding, we don't have to fund your research, and those types of philosophies, and to what extent do they help and not help? That really is. And sometimes people may say, when we are in this painful bubble that we're in, maybe at some point people will be good at looking for money and doing their own thing. Who knows, right? I don't know. So it's nice to have this discussion further. If you, at some point, maybe I'm taking too much time because it's already after 8 on this, but we can always take it further.
Yeah, but I like your reflections, to be honest. I think I haven't really engaged a lot in terms of thinking about the state philosophy and how and what the state philosophy and its implications on urban governance. That's really interesting, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think this is interesting, but you can take it off Teams. Thank you. So, Roderick, I don't know if you can unmute and ask your question, or you prefer that I ask it from the chat. I read it from the chat. Roderick, you can hear me?
A very good evening to you all. I was just a bit camera shy, so I felt like it was a bit more appropriate if you could read it out, but thank you so much. Okay, so my name is Dr. Roderick. I'm basically from the University of Sunderland. So before I start, basically I was just enjoying your presentation, and what prompted me to ask this question was, in Harare currently, not just in Harare, in Zimbabwe in general, you often see a lot of these informal settlements. At the same time, we also have a lot of newsstands and what and so forth. And we have heard about these issues about, well, if you buy this, maybe the government will come and take it and what and so forth. So now I was beginning to think to say, yes, there's a bit of land and what and so forth, but the gap now between the formal planning now, which is on paper, but at the same time, if you take a look at the lived reality on basically the lived reality on the ground is just so vast. So what happens to the role of the urban planner? Whose responsibility is it? From the municipality or maybe from the investors? the government, etc. And also, how can we prevent in the near future these informal settlements that tend to pop up, not just looking from the Harare point of view, but even if you take a look from the regional point of view, like in South Africa, we've got these other areas close by within Khayelitsha, Guguletu, and many other areas. So how can we be able to prevent such things? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I may not answer it, in a comprehensive way, but let me try. Sometimes the role of the planner is conflicted. It's planners are operating in a very tense environment, especially in our context, because everything boils down to the politics of it, right? You have to be able to, because when you're doing these things, you obviously be dealing with politicians, the people, and a lot of vested interests as well, especially when it comes to land and so forth. So I think if you look at, I think now there was, this talk about the commissioner report on land and what was happening, and it needs to be published, and the reflections in that report are really very troubling. It looks like, planners are there to facilitate development and making sure that everything is done according to the principles of planning, which is order, amenity, safety, and so forth. But sometimes that kind of textbook understanding of planning doesn't really work. Politics comes in, the councillor grabs the land and starts subdividing, like what has been happening in Caledonia and all these places. It becomes a problem. But in terms of how do we prevent, the solution is it's a bit structural, because if you don't provide housing or build housing or social housing and for these people, informal settlements will always continue to sprout. And the solution is not to remove and eradicate them, but when they're already there, it's already a community. How do we support that? Now even UN Habitat advocate for in situ upgrading, working with the communities, in terms of what is their vision about their neighborhood. Let's work together. Let's not displace people. Let's improve, upgrade the roads, upgrade the housing, and so forth, so that at least it meets the standard that is expected based on planning. So it's always a complex scenario, because when you start to think about politics and the political economy, everything boils down to the politics. But I think it's important to work with these communities and kind of implement this comprehensive in situ upgrading. I think we're conscious of time. I think. Thank you.
We are conscious of time indeed. Yes, but there was one last point in the chat. I think it has been replied by Dr. Edmond. We've got one last comment from Rumbi Mpashlo. So Rumbi, can you make it short, and Dr. Elmond, make it very short?
Yes.
So yes, Rumbi, you can unmute your mic, please. Rumbi, we can't hear you if you're speaking, but may you please unmute your mic?
Hello,
yes, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, just a quick one. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Elmond, and everyone for the submissions and comments. For me, I wanted to find out if this necropolitics, does it see the people as victims, or does it present people as victims, or the homeless people, or those who are in the informal settlements? Are they passive? Is it like those, they're just at the receiving end of what the government is doing, like presenting it like bad life? Or it also, because there are people also take themselves to those settlements, like in Zimbabwe. Yes, there are people who have been displaced, but there's some who willingly go to those places. So yeah, that is my question.
Yeah, they are not passive victims. I think in the paper that in GeoForum, I talk about negotiating necropolitics, like how do they negotiate? How do they try to challenge some of those things? And one way is through their own initiatives and trying to say, even if the state doesn't come, this is what we can do on our own to survive. So they are not entirely passive victims, but they can institute their own resistance in some way to challenge some of those things. Yes, it happens everywhere, individually and collectively. Yeah, there are a lot of movements trying to challenge some of this exclusion.
Okay, so thank you to everyone. I hope you can all see my screen. I am presenting the next presenter, Dr. Jocelyn Chigwada. She's a university librarian from the Chile University of Technology, but she's also a postdoc in the South African University. So she'll come and talk to us about publishing as a Zimbabwean researcher in Zimbabwe, right? We're not talking about Zimbabwean researchers like Dr. Elmond, who is being paid for by his university in Canada. We're talking about people who are in Zimbabwe who want to publish as Zimbabwean researchers in Zimbabwe, and the open access journals that you can use, and the risk and mitigations of publishing. So please join us on the 27th of May, 2026 at the same time. And this is her title, and hope to see you all. So thank you for coming today, and thank you to the presenter today, Dr. Elmond. We appreciate your discussion. It was quite, to me, it was quite emotional and mind-opening because I've got the lived experience of living in one of these areas. And thank you to the co-host today, Dr. Chatenda and Professor Edmond. And thank you to everyone who asked questions and everyone who suggested something. So next time, please don't be camera shy. Be vulnerable like all of us. Yes, don't be camera shy. Don't be shy to ask your questions. So see you next time, and hope to see you on the 27th of May. Thank you, and have a good evening and a good weekend. Bye.
Thank you, guys.